Right, we have Deb joining us on Zoom as well. Welcome back, Deb, after feeding, nap time, sleep time and bath time. Look, just because of time, I want to quickly go down the panel, and in less than 1 minute, look, we've heard a lot of stuff, and so we could go away from here feeling pretty down, thinking we're going to hell in a handbasket. And so I really need you guys. Where's Alfred? So, cheapers, he does 20 minutes work and then he sits down. Must have been a Sparky. Or a national MP. Gee. So I need you to give us some encouragement, basically, as to what can we take away. We've identified the problem. We've looked at some of the solutions, but we're in the changing shed. We're about to go onto the field. As somebody, was it you, John, said, it's like us as All Black. When I was in Cape Town with Lyle Shelton, I actually went to a game, the final of the Sevens, where South Africa was playing the All Black Sevens. And I was the only Kiwi in the whole of the Cape Town stadium with my flag. And what was worse was that we scored first. And I was actually slightly fearful for my life, but they were all loving it and mocking me. So I feel like that's how we're going into the culture. We're up against it, as you alluded to, John. So kick us off. Give us a word of encouragement.
I found incredible encouragement from what all the other speakers have been saying, and just drawing from some of their key points. The first one is that we have a stand that is rooted and based in truth. And this is a generation that is dying for truth. And I think we have movements now that are getting us so far away from truth that even our neighbours who are secular can see that something is very, very wrong. And what we're hoping for is like this kairos moment, like a light bulb moment, where people go, hang on a minute, this is one step too far. And then we get the opportunity, when we have those people who have that moment, to share our faith, share a reason for the hope that is within us. It's events like these that equip you with the truths that you need to speak confidently, knowing that when you shine truth into a situation, it will always prevail.
Thank you. Walt?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we can take away from this and be encouraged by is, I read to you the countries that had started this that are now stopping it. That's a huge thing. They're finding that it's causing harm. There's another one that you should be encouraged by. It's a website started by somebody that my wife and I know, called r/dtrans. It's a Reddit site, and it has about 50,000 regretters and detransitioners on the site. It's a place for them to go and talk about. And I have several thousand people in ours, but we work hand in hand with them and we help them individually. This website, r/dtrans on Reddit, is just kind of an open forum for people to come and express the failure about this process. And I think what we're seeing now with Chloe, I mentioned, I think last night, that I've done been in over 23 documentary films. What we're really seeing, we're starting to see the edge of the collapse. And that's why I want you to be encouraged. While it looks like they're winning, the fact of the matter is they're losing. The people who are being harmed by this are stepping out. I mean, I started talking about the regret stuff 33 years ago, and there was nobody out there but me. Now there are literally thousands of people who are joining in this chorus. Be encouraged. This is going to collapse.
Thank you. John?
History is always important if you want to understand what might happen in the future. No doubt about that at all. And at about the time that Australia was settled, was a bit before New Zealand, of course, you had a young parliamentarian in England by the name of William Wilberforce convicted that he ought to dedicate his life to overcoming corruption and evil in British politics and ending the slave trade. He's just a young MP. He never left the backbench, actually, because he was involved with such unpopular causes. He was, when he became a believer after entering the Parliament, it's believed there was only one other person in that whole parliament in what we think of as a more Christian age than this, who believed in the Christian gospel. But he set out faithfully. Others slowly joined him, freed slaves, the wealthiest bankers in England and therefore the world at the time, the Quakers, all sorts of unlikely allies slowly joined. And over time, they wore the opposition down, and the mightiest empire that the world had ever seen, for the first time that any empire had ever done it, abolished slavery. Firstly, the slave trade, and a few years later, slavery itself. And then they put their Royal Navy, manned by whites, I might add, out on the high seas to stop other countries trading in human misery. Those were extraordinary things that we need to learn from our history. At the time that he died, it's estimated that 3/4 of the British Parliament were card-carrying evangelicals. His great friend was, of course, the author of Amazing Grace, John Newton. At the time that he became an Anglican minister, which was an extraordinary story in itself, he was the only Bible-believing Anglican minister in Britain. All the other Bible-believing pulpits were held by Methodists and nonconformists and Baptists. The Anglican Church had no place for people who believed the Bible. But at the time that he died, there were an estimated 400 Bible-preaching people in English pulpits. And then began the great age of domestic reform. Lord Shaftesbury, another Christian believer, labour laws, protecting children and women. Britain went from being a desolate, godless, empty sepulchre of a nation into a place of enormous solidarity and a force for good. And if you doubt that, none of us would be here if it were not for Great Britain in 1939. None of us.
Okay. Kevin.
Well, I'd say don't let a vocal minority, a vocal opinionated minority, take over the conversation, because you're actually in the majority. And sometimes, as Walt was saying, people need to, burn their hand to realize that the stove is hot. But they will realize it eventually. We're seeing huge backlashes to what's happening in the drug movement in Canada, in the United States, because people are starting to feel the heat. Now, again, I'll just emphasize it again, here with the cannabis issue, you are actually in the scientific majority. That was just taken. So never forget that.
Alfred?
I think that we need to stop asking for authority to do things, because the truth is God's already given us authority. We need to be asking for strategy. I remember that in the debate in Parliament when David Seymour was taking debate around euthanasia through. And Dr. Theo Boer came from the Netherlands, and previously he used to be a supporter of euthanasia. That changed because he saw the harm that it had to his country and to his nation. He showed us one slide that in the Netherlands there were these little black spots that were around the slides where there was no euthanasia that was happening there. I asked him the question, why was that? And he said it's where churches were active in their communities. And then during the debate, I had a meeting with Aged Concern. And they said to me, we oppose this because it's unsafe. And I said, well, what's the greatest concern that you have for the elderly in our community? And he said, it's simple. It's called loneliness. So what's your strategy? He said, well, what we try to do is to get a volunteer program that maybe people could take 1 hour of their day a week to go and have a cup of tea and a biscuit with one of these older people and just give them some friendship, the sense of belonging. And I said, and how's that going for you? We can't get people. So, we're all sitting around saying, Lord, give us the authority, tell us what to do. That's over. You've already been given a great commission. So you have authority. We need to be asking for strategy. And you see, while we see the law is there, we want to fight legislation from the front. Remember King David, and the second time he had to get the Philistines, then the Lord said, no, don't go to the front, go around the side and go from behind. The truth is, with Wilberforce, God gave him the strategy of going behind. Because he didn't, the abolition of slavery didn't come because everyone agreed it was wrong. Do you remember, if you know the story? It was because it was around trade. The ability for the slave ships to begin to be able to trade. So the strategy is how we can overcome some of these big issues. It's not always at the front. There are those who are called to do that. You imagine that if we started dealing with loneliness in our country, guarantee you'll begin to slow down and even stop the whole need for euthanasia.
And finally, Deb.
Yeah, look, there's lots of strong men and especially strong women that are really speaking up in this space around fairness in sport. There's lots of organisations and foundations who are really being really courageous in this space, and I just think that if we can also have the courage to speak up, that's going to make such a difference. There's Save Women's Sport in a few different countries, Binary Group. There's lots of senators and politicians who are speaking about this. Sportsmen, Andrew Bogart, former NBA player, and some of his mates are, really getting into this as well. And of course, lots of sportswomen who are speaking up quite courageously, and some are going to court over it as well. So there's lots of ways that you can subscribe and just get emails and get updates so that you know what's going on in this space, and just to know some of the facts to be able to, I guess, spread the word and tell other people. Again, someone mentioned last night, we know who wins this battle. In the end, we know who's the winner overall. So yeah, we just got to keep fighting the good fight and speaking up really unapologetically, in my opinion. And I feel like the tide is turning, and there are lots of really strong people that are speaking up, and we just got to keep doing that as well.
Okay, I'm just going to do some questions specific, and just some of the high-rated ones on the Q&A. Walt, this one got quite high ratings. How do we respond when working with youth who want us to use, for example, different pronouns? How do we support them well without compromising on truth? In other words, how do we love, but also with truth?
Yeah. I don't ever use pronouns. That's a personal thing. I can talk to anybody in this room for hours and never use a pronoun, so I'm not sure why we're even having the discussion. We usually use pronouns in referring to somebody that's somewhere else, not when they're in front of us, so I don't get that part. And so I think, what I do is probably real different than anybody else. But can you believe that? I always ask people, what happened that caused you to not like who you are? And then I proceed, because it gets them to reflect. Instead of being out in front of it, they have to come back and they have to think about, how did I get here? That's what I want people to do. And so I think that there's nothing wrong with asking people good, solid questions. And then when they tell you what happened, or they say, I don't know what happened, then ask some probing questions. What was your childhood like? Did you have difficulty? Was there a death in the family? I mean, I worked with somebody recently who finally had to come to the point to where it was through a family member and some other people that we knew about, that the girl became identified as a boy because her dad died in an airplane crash. But it took a while for her to realize the trauma from that. It wasn't about gender dysphoria, it was about her dad dying. So I think it's important for us to understand this is not about gender, that if we ask good questions and ask them how they began to feel this way and what caused them to feel this way, then focus on that. That's what we need to do. That's very loving. It's very helpful. Anytime we can prevent somebody from taking hormones and having surgery, by golly, you've done a great job.
Okay, Kevin, there was a study that came out this week from Otago University that ranked drugs and basically said that alcohol is the worst drug around compared to any other drug. And in response, the usual pro-drug groups and the media immediately implied that we need to legalise all drugs. What's your response?
Well, the implication of that is that if we're going to take their methodology, which I actually really question, then the implication of that is that alcohol is the worst drug because it's legal, available, and commercialized. Why would we want to repeat that again? That's like saying, it's like saying my headlights are broken, so you know what, I'll break my taillights just to be consistent. I'm not an alcohol prohibitionist, okay? But because that train has left the station. By the way, alcohol has been widely used in Western civilization since before the Old Testament. I'm not saying, cannabis wasn't used thousands of years ago. It was a very different product. It was by some isolated civilizations in certain echelons of those civilizations. The cannabis is by definition counterculture, right? It's not mainstream culture. So alcohol, we pay the price, by the way, hundreds of millions of dollars of lost social costs, the number one reason why people are incarcerated, the number one cause of violence of any drug, and by the way, the number one reason in America why you get arrested is an alcohol-related arrest. So for those people that want to legalize drugs because we need to help, people not get incarcerated, actually alcohol has had the opposite. Number one, and number two, the methodology, and I won't get sort of geeky here and scientific, but the methodology of these ranking systems is really hogwash. It's a way to get in the news by saying I've devised this magical formula which says that this is number one and that's number 7 and that's number 8. It doesn't take into account so many things. The biology of each individual person, your DNA, the environment, so many other factors that I actually really don't like these ranking systems. And the ranking system was invented a few years ago by a very self-involved legalizer professor in England. And I hate to say this, but aptly named. I mean, his real name is David Nutt. Nutt is his real name. I did not make that up. And he is the big. You can't make this. You cannot make this stuff up. I wish I could make that up. And he's, written 15,000, publications apparently. But anyway, he's not regarded in the mainstream medical community. But he speaks at these psychedelic conferences. He speaks at these cannabis conferences. He gets paid very wealthy sums for this. And he came up with this numerical system, which has been totally debunked by really the top researchers. Who actually are agnostic about legalization in the field, sort of academics who've looked at that from a really objective point of view and said, this is really not what you're supposed to do. So I think that's what happened here in New Zealand where they redid, and they did it in Dunedin, I think. Ironic, because Dunedin is where, I don't know if you all know this and I'll stop, but it's important, I didn't mention it earlier. Dunedin is where we have the most important research on cannabis that's been done for the last 50 years because it's the longitudinal study, as I'm sure many of you know, following the same people born in the early 1970s, checking in with them every 8 years. It's an incredible thing. And for cannabis, it's found that if you use cannabis at least 3 times a week for 3 years of your adolescence, you have a significantly elevated risk of an 8-point loss in your IQ score. By the way, 8 points is enough to take you from an average student to well below average. It's a few $1 million when you add it all up in lost income in your lifetime and hours of productivity. That's what 8 points is. That came from Dunedin. So I would regard that research a lot more than this ranking stuff.
Okay, Deb, could I ask you, you've made a stand, you had to be brave and you timed it well. A lot of your colleagues are too scared to do it. And there may be people around us that are a little bit scared of speaking out. How do we deal with that?
That's to me, isn't it? Sorry, Bob. Yep. I guess I do understand that if you're an athlete in amongst your training and you've got contracts and there's, a lot more women's teams playing football and playing cricket that have got contracts and, finally on TV, women's sport, if they have a contract which says they have to abide by the rules and code of conduct and all that sort of thing, I do understand that you're almost really gagged in saying anything. You will lose your contract, you will get kicked off your team, you will probably get fined as well. So I do understand that there are a lot of athletes that are still competing that don't want to talk about this. I guess there's a lot of athletes who have finished their career who don't want to deal with this issue either. I've got friends actually that live in our street, a few doors down, Olympic gold medalist swimmer. They don't particularly have anything really invested in the future of sport. They've done their sport, they've done their career, and they've gone. They don't want to be, someone Googling their name and it coming up that they're talking about this issue. So I guess I understand if it doesn't affect you, why other people aren't really talking about it in this space. But the fact is that I'm one of the few female athletes in Australia who have actually competed against a biological male at a Commonwealth Games at a high level, international competition. So, the CEO at the time, who was my coach of our sport, he sent a letter to the IOC, to the International Weightlifting Federation, to New Zealand Weightlifting, to lots of different countries in the Commonwealth to try to band everybody together and just say this is ridiculous and we want international weightlifting to make a call on this. And we didn't get a response, I think, from anybody. So, you know, the fact that I had such a passionate coach who was the CEO of our national sport, who was willing to put his name and his face to, you know, to the letter as well, I think was really encouraging for me, because I can imagine if there's politics going on and, you know, he would never get picked for a team to be an international coach ever again. But, you know, yeah, for these people that had the guts to kind of stand around me as well, and that were impacted by it, could see how much I was impacted by it, I think that's really what, you know, encouraged me to speak about it. And again, I sort of keep talking about my 3 daughters. I just don't want them to experience this unfairness. And at least I had, you know, done most of my career. I'd competed. I was pretty much in my last competition where this happened. So, you know, I really feel for women who are competing in, say, AFL and getting tackled and knocked out, and, you know, other people that are competing, other women that are competing now in this space. So, yeah, I just don't know for them how they can speak up if they're going to lose their contracts. But I guess I just want to encourage, you know, any person, not just, you know, you don't have to be a past athlete, but if you've heard my story and you understand how unfair it was, you know, please use me as an example, or please use other women that have spoken up in this space as an example. There was a top surfer who said she wouldn't surf again until, you know, this was made right. So I just feel like when you speak up with logic, and common sense, I just think it really makes a difference. And I guess, like I said, I've had that much experience in this sport that I just feel like I'm well within my rights to talk about my experience and how that affected me, and how the science is totally stacked up to say it's not fair. Yeah, and just to basically call it out when it's you know, presented as though it's purely based on a testosterone level or something like that.
Okay.
So I think that's just fair.
Thank you, Deb. John Anderson, this question's well above my IQ level. Do you believe we should challenge not just Marx, but also earlier revolutionaries, Locke, Rousseau, Hobbes, to counter today's revolution? Sorry, I dozed off reading the question.
It obviously comes from a classicist, and good on that, whoever the classicist is. Look, I think what I would say is a good smattering knowledge of our sort of cultural roots is incredibly important in this life, and even more important in the next. I mean, we heard Walt give an outstanding overview of, or enthusiastic declaration of the value of his faith. It's based, of course, in historical knowledge. That's what the Bible is. So history is important. It's our greatest guide, and those who know Christ will know that it can unlock the real secrets of life. But it's the same politically. It's of a lesser order, but it's not unimportant. And we need to understand how we came to enjoy what I call the 4 freedoms, in order that we go out then and are able to defend them. Sorry, what was that? Somebody from Australia?
Didgeridoo.
It was probably the ABC. I'll talk to Kevin later. You see, he's so used to... He's so used to North America and the fact that he can't get a reliable reflection on what's happening through the media. And now that he's moved to Canada, he's got the nationalised radio service there. You've got one in New Zealand and one in Australia. So we can all rely on being told the truth regularly, can't we? Isn't that how it works? Anyway.
Something like that.
So look, a good smattering knowledge of how we got to where we are is, I think, important. And if you want to dig deeply, you can read very, very widely. But in this day and age of modern technology, I mean, the internet is an absolute minefield of gold, just as much as it is of complete and dangerous dross. And you can go there and hear really fascinating expositions of all sorts of great and important ideas. You know, I think of some of the things we've been talking about today. You know, really, you think of Erica Commissar on raising children. You think in your area of irreparable harm by, help me, Abigail Shire. You think of a mental genius of the level of an Os Guinness, not so well known as he ought to be, but unpacking why liberty is at risk in the West. It's all there, and I can't help saying it. There are many sites you can go to but johnanderson.net.au is the bad one.
Jeepers, that'll be $100. And just John Steenhoff question, can you describe other work HRLA is doing, as well as legal cases, political advocacy, media presence, legal advice, or is it a focus mainly on litigation?
Yeah, Sir Bob, thank you.
Yeah. You're welcome.
Yeah, today I focused in my stories about everyday Australians who face hostility, but we do a lot more than that. One of the things I'm really excited about is that this year, for the first time, we're bringing in faculty from all around Australia to a 1-week legal academy for law students. When I talk to people who have been doing this work long term and I ask them, where are you finding your lawyers? They say, we don't find them, we trained them. So we started 10, 15, 20 years ago bringing in law students and giving them a formation in Christian worldview and a knowledge of the history of our legal system and its Christian roots, and then trying to give them the mentoring that they need to continue in the legal system in wherever God's calling them, whether it be family law, corporate law, as a judge, as a barrister, with a well-formed Christian worldview. So that's what we're doing this year. We had 50 students from around Australia make application. We've got places for 25, and it's something, Lord willing, that we will do every year. Some of the other things we do is submissions on some of the terrible laws that Australia is proposing in both our states and at a federal level. And one of the big things that we come up against is fake law, particularly fake international law, which is the major human rights bodies in Australia ignore and they pick and choose between how these laws are interpreted at an international level. So it seems like the international community is this complete godless and anti-theist organisation, when in fact much of the interpretation of these human rights statutes internationally helps the Christian and gives a real balance that we can call on. So I have someone working for me who literally wrote the book on the international civil and a covenant on civil and political rights, and he helps me to make those submissions saying, hang on, that's fake law, this here is real law. The other thing we do is, rather than just being an ambulance at the bottom of the cliff, helping people who've got into trouble, we're helping Christians and organisations navigate at the top of the cliff, how to be faithful, wise, and legally compliant. Because a lot of pressure is coming on by bureaucrats, by the managerial class who oversee all of these things, particularly like for Christian schools. You have an education review office here. They will come in and tell you how they interpret the law, which is not necessarily anywhere close to where the boundaries of the law are, and always encroach on religious freedom. So we come in and try to proactively give schools strategies for dealing with their legal compliance and upskill them with the fact that they're not going to be in a courtroom 2 weeks after their contract for enrolment makes the national news. They're going to be tried in the court of a public opinion long before they see a courtroom, which will be 2-3 years away. So we try to give them the crisis management systems, the allied advisors who can give them advice, the communication strategies that are going to allow them to stay strong when they're in the crucible of the media, the social media, all of the cultural tastemakers who then weigh in, the politicians, none of whom hold to a Christian worldview and are absolutely going to be pushing them to recant, to step back, and to withdraw. Right. And so that's just some of the work we're doing. Bob, I know you've got other questions.
Fantastic. No, Bob, you were deeply fascinated and engaged in that. When you yawned at me, I'm hurt. I would have liked the trigger warning, and I'll talk to you later.
So, Deb, and to all our speakers present on stage, we just want to thank you. This has been an amazing forum. Would you show your appreciation, please, to all the speakers?